Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Welcome back, engagers, to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And today we have Erik with us. But before we kick off, Erik, are you prepared to engage?
I am, and I was waiting for you to pronounce my surname because you are probably one of the few people who can pronounce it properly, and you didn't.
Erik Agudelo is a researcher and developer of learning solutions, and he's the founder of Play, Learn, Develop, and, he's also a vegetarian. His research and products combine the use of human behavior, tabletop games, and artificial intelligence, data science, and all those trendy and cool things that can come in very, very handy. And over the past 2 years, he has worked with the University of Economics Krakow in Poland and with Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. And currently, he is working on a project to take ToolBox for Creativity's latest L&amp product to Kickstarter. And we might talk about that in a future episode as well. And he's also applying for EU funding to develop his umbrella research at the Human-Centered Organisational Transformation Framework. So, Erik Agudelo, is there anything we're missing from that intro that you want to make sure that we know before we start with the regular questions?
No, you got it all. That's the main stuff. There are probably, small little things that I am doing, and I'm trying to keep track of what I do by putting vlogs on YouTube. But majority.
So you don't forget what you did yesterday, right?
Pretty much, yes.
Sounds fantastic. So, Erik, we always like to understand our guests a little bit more beyond the introduction, beyond knowing the fantastic things you've done. What does it, look like, feel like? What is Erik doing on a day-to-day basis, or, every now and then? Like, what does a day or a week with you look like? We're going to be there with you.
Perfect. To be honest, I even ask myself the question, and I try to monitor what I do by using...
and you use YouTube.
No, in this case, I use... Google Calendar, and I'm like, whatever I'm doing, I'm trying to put little blocks in there and using different colors to really keep track of what I'm doing, because I am, as we say, in Venezuela, cooking a couple of stews at the same time, and I don't want some of them to burn. And so what I do is, in the morning, I look at my calendar, if I have any calls, if I have any meetings, and then I try to organize my day. As you mentioned, I'm running this Kickstarter. And Kickstarters can be really interesting, but can be really frustrating. And, if you want to know more about that, we can talk about it. But so I need to put the activities in the calendar for the Kickstarter. And at the same time, I'm running a couple of kind of interviews, talks to primarily people in Ireland. And this is because of the partnership with Trinity College. And what we're doing is we are looking for people who are willing to test this human-centered organizational transformation framework that you mentioned. So it requires a lot of conversations, a lot of creating documents, sharing with them, infographics, and, so that's pretty much what I'm doing at the moment. And I try to put it in my calendar, and I try to stay focused, because otherwise time flies.
Yes, it does. And there's the... I forget that it's like Murphy, but it's not Murphy's. Maybe it is Murphy's law that, tasks expand as much as you give them time to expand. So you give them 5 hours, it takes 5 hours. You give them 3 hours, it takes 3 hours. So it's the time boxing is a very interesting technique I've been hearing a lot of lately. And it seems you are applying it, cutting edge technology in that sense.
Out of desperation, yes.
So as you mentioned, Erik, you are also from Venezuela, but you're also Irish. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was born in Venezuela. I lived there until I was 18, 19, I believe, and moved to Ireland. And I lived there. I was working, studying. I blinked, and 17 years passed. And in this period, I became Irish, yes.
Interesting profile, and interesting. And now you're in Poland, which is where I was getting to as well, because as you know, I'm from Venezuela. My mom is Polish, so I'm also technically Polish. And there's, these strange links that you find with people around. And since we met I think it was originally in a Gamification Europe, is that correct?
That's when we met face to face, but I believe we started talking because I saw your profile and it was really interesting. We had a call, if I remember well, to talk about, using games in education and, stuff like this. Yeah.
No, I never talk about that. Interesting. So, Erik, now we know, what you do, what's your day-to-day. Now we want to go sort of into the deep questions, right? So the first one is about a fail moment or a first attempt in learning. We want to, know which is your favorite, or one do you feel you learned from the most. We want to be in that story. We want to, sort of go to the ground level with you, feel the pain and then feel, what were those lessons? What would you do differently, or how you got out of that failure?
Okay, so that is something quite fresh. It's happening right now. And, so this partnership that I mentioned with Trinity College, and I probably spoke quite a lot about this in the intro. And what I realized is that I didn't mention the word games or gamification. And perhaps this is because I'm training myself sometimes not to use these words. And this is the thing that is frustrating me at the moment. I'm taking the research. The research combines artificial intelligence, human behavior, data science, and active learning, aka, serious games, gamification, and all of this. But the frustrating part is that when I take this to people that work in corporations, because this human-centered organizational transformation framework will be used primarily, for the moment anyway, in corporations, in corporate learning, the moment that people, unfortunately, decision makers, they see the war games, majority of them tend to just kind of lose faith. And then getting from that point that people are not interested and regaining their interest is a very difficult thing. You can approach people who know nothing about the subject but are willing to listen. But if for whatever reason they say this is not for me, to try to convince them otherwise is extremely difficult. So this is the frustrating part. And kind of answering the second part of the question, what have I done? So I try different things, but I suppose the one that I'm using at the moment, and it seems to be working, is that the solutions that I create, they involve different things: technology, physical games, even a framework for evaluation and implementation. So as a result of all of this, I put it all together, and I do not call them games, I call them learning solutions. So we start from that point, and when I start explaining to people how everything works, I do then mention the active learning. And still, as I'm doing right now, I sometimes refuse to use the word games, because once I do it, it's like goodbye, So there will come a time in, our lives when, people will understand the power of games. But unfortunately for now, there is a certain demographic that tends to be the decision-making in corporations. And they do not understand games.
And they don't want to in many cases, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It makes sense. In fact, I think it was on the podcast. I'm trying to remember who I had this conversation with. It was relatively recently that we were saying, no, actually it was in a class. Now I know. That we were saying, like, there's like different profiles of people here. And the thing is, some people, could be open to this. Some people are not. And there's like different approaches, especially with profile, somebody like you, that is going actively towards clients and, working on this whole thing. There's the people that, like you, are, doing great work on games and gamification, but calling it some other way, which is in a shape or form, it is also helping the industry move forward, because you're creating this portfolio, so to speak, of success in a way. So then when you start saying, well, what we did was actually games and gamification, or when you show it to another client, or when you bring it to a conference, it is a good way to show that success and to expand the industry. There's other people who are saying, look, you know what I do is games, what I do is gamification. If you don't like the word, you can find somebody else. They're probably doing well enough to not sort of care about losing the occasional client because of this. But these are two approaches, and they are as valid, as any other in that sense. But I do think there is I don't want to say a divide, because it's not like they're facing one another. It's just like a different way to see things. Do you have any opinion on that?
Sure. I mean, as I said, I hope there will be a time in our lives, yours and mine, this kind of generation, where we can sell games and people will say, yes, that's a great tool for teaching. But unfortunately for now, even though the people receiving, and this is kind of one of those contradictions in life, the people receiving the training, the people receiving the education are willing and looking forward to use games or something else, let's call it active learning. The people controlling the administration of knowledge, in this case, the teachers, the universities, colleges, are not willing to take that step. So, but things change, the world changes, we are getting better at many things. So perhaps in, next decades or whatever, I will be happy enough to say, this is a game and I want to sell it to you as a product. But for now, unfortunately, what I'm saying is that I learned very quickly by losing people interests,
very quick, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. And Erik, actually, let's just go ahead and turn this around entirely. Tell us about a time where instead of having a fail experience and, overcoming it or whatever, it's actually of a time of success, something that you're proud of, that you want to, maybe it's kind of a show and tell in a way. And of course, we still want to keep the lessons coming. So maybe you can give us a few keys of what you feel helped you get to that level of success.
Let's see. Still talking about this research that I'm doing, when we first identified something like 15, because we were looking for people who manage transformations. This is transformations in corporations, and there are many kinds of transformation, but we kept the definition pretty broad. So we hire consultants, and this is through Trinity College. We got money from the government of Ireland to hire the consultants. And off he went to look for these transformation specialist managers, directors. And a lot of people listened to what the consultant had to say. They filled the survey, but they actually said, we don't really want to know more about this. This is not for us. And there were comments that were expected, but still a little bit hurting. Comments like, oh, this type of training may be good for junior people, but not for senior people. Directors are busy and they don't want to know anything about games, this kind of stuff. But
check their phones.
Yes, I know. But
check their personal lives with children. You'll be horrified by how much they play. It's terrible.
But then after I follow up with them directly, because that was the last part of the engagement with them. So I went to them directly and I said, listen, you spoke to the consultants, and, I refer to him by name, of course, and all of this. And then we had a Zoom and I show presentations or maybe little videos of pre-recordings of how I run my training with my products and all of this. And some of them, not all, but some of them, their eyes got like really big and really happy. And they wanted to tell me more about how they themselves are using some active learning techniques, even though they might not call it like that. But we found common grounds, and they got really happy and they wanted to tell me more about what they were doing. So the lessons learned here, one of them anyway, is that these people who originally said no, after getting more information and after seeing how some of these things work, they got really excited. And right now I need to collect at least, say, for example, 3 people who support the products in Ireland. I'm focusing in Ireland because the university is in Dublin. But the 2 companies that have already issued the letter saying that they are willing to support the the development of the product and the research, initially said, no, thank you, this is not for me. So that to me is really exciting, and it made me kind of happy.
Changing their minds and realizing how things can change, and when you go deeper and they understand what you're proposing is always, I would argue, is always a better route to success. When, the initial answer might be, maybe, yeah, don't call me, I'll call you. That kind of thing. So absolutely, that makes a lot of sense, Erik. And of course, with all this time that you've been investing on this, with all the toolboxes you've been using and creating yourself, you've probably, had quite a bit of experience, and you have a way of doing things. And we would like to know about that way, or that process, or that framework or toolbox. Can you, in, 4 or 5 minutes, tell us what are, if it's steps, like what does that look like? You arrive and you want to use games or gamification in a solution. How do you approach it? What do you do when that happens?
Okay. So if the solution is to be developed from scratch, let's say you go to a client and the client has a problem, don't really know what the solution may be.
Yeah.
So that's an excellent opportunity because you have like a white page where you can draw anything you want. One thing I realized a lot of people do is if they are already working with physical games, they tend to stick to that type of technology. Same for people who use mobile games or digital games. So one of the first things that I noticed was that, and I decided technology, the shape of the game is a tool that you use to solve a problem, but it shouldn't be the main avenue that you take for every single problem that you encounter in your life. So I took that idea and I put it like right into the first page of whatever I'm doing. And I try to even combine physical games with digital technologies or vice versa, digital games with physical technologies, not to stick to one single type, as I said, of delivery method. So that's something that I really kind of push further in the research, and I call it hybrid games. We saw a lot of this now by accident. It's an unfortunate situation, but it brought out this quite a lot, which is COVID. We saw a lot of people who were traditionally playing board games, and the industry, was trying to diversify, and they ended up releasing more of something that existed before, but it wasn't quite popular, which is the digital companion for the board games, and now seems to be pretty popular. Something else that also was pushed further as a result of these restrictions introduced by COVID was tabletop simulator. So you can play your favorite games with the person you're wanting to play, or with total strangers, which is actually a really nice, interesting experience. And you can do it online, you can do it on your computer. And of course, it's not the same, but that doesn't mean that it's less or worse. It's just simply different.
Yeah, it's a completely different experience, and it's a nice way to do that. So, is there a way you might want to? I don't know. I know you talked about your hybrid tendencies, so to speak, on games. Is there? I don't know. I don't want to push it too far, but is there some? I do this, then this, and then that, or is it complete? Maybe it's completely freestyle, so to speak, and you just sort of do it on the go. I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper, if possible.
Sure, but I mean, I try to use the technology not so much at the beginning. I try to start prototyping with a low technology, and I take these lessons learned from, or way of working rather, from tools, or I don't know what to call it, methodologies such as design thinking and any type of design in general, which is start pen and paper prototyping. Even if you're developing something as complex as a car or some piece of technology, starting with pen and paper prototyping is a really powerful technique. Then you start evolving, and then you decide where to invest your time and your money for the development of the technology. So at some points, maybe after the second, third iteration, both the physical part and the digital part start to develop. In one of the games I created in the past, as I was creating the physical, say, for example, the cards with some events that took place in this game. The game was designed to teach project management. At the same time, I was creating some wireframes for the companion video that sort of set the stage for the game. So both were evolving, and both started with paper prototyping. So in my case, I really don't, at least consciously, start with one element and then switch to the other. I try to keep both evolving because they are connected.
Makes sense. That's great.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
So Erik, is there, when you think of all this experience you've had, all the projects you've worked on, would you say that there is some sort of best practice, something that you would say, well, you think of this, you use this, and it's usually, at least, or most times, going to benefit your project for the better?
Yes, testing it. You create your products, and when I say create, I'm not talking about the final product, but from the beginning, once you have a prototype, test it. And test it with people you believe are close enough to the population that the product is intended for. And a technique that I came across, even before I started designing games, because the way I came into games, in contact with games, it's kind of funny, was through academia, rather than most of us come in contact with games because we want to have fun. In my case, it was through academia. And I came across this evaluation technique, which is just observing people as they play games. And then there are some markers that you have to analyze the behavior of people, how they react to certain circumstances, and then try to draw conclusions from these moments. So when you are collecting data as well, look at how people interact with your game. There are different stages of testing, but even from the beginning, as I said, once you have an idea, and even if you put it on paper prototyping, you can still test that idea. And I know it can be frustrating. I know it for sure. When I was testing as well, one game I have not completed, but I was testing it anyway. There were some comments and people were getting really frustrated. And it can be hurtful if you're the designer and you're listening to that. But you just need to kind of bite your tongue and listen to people interact with your game, because you learn a lot, and you do learn a lot. It's quite amazing how much you learn by just looking at people interact with your products.
This is something, again, that I just finished my class with a master that is called Master in Customer Experience and Innovation. We had a class on gamification. We had a couple of classes on that. And of course, their experience, they have a lot of things on, iteration and prototyping and, play testing and all these things. So they were kind of versed in that sense. So that was not a tough sell. But usually the whole thing of, testing and being uncomfortable with those, difficult comments or seeing the frustration of your players is something that is really, really hard to get across, especially with a new audience in that sense. Once you've seen people who have, been there, done that, they do recognize relatively easily the value of doing this. With new audiences, it kind of gets to be a bit more difficult, but I do agree it is critical. It is critical to test early and as much as you can along the way to correct your path as soon as possible, not, once it's maybe a little bit too late.
Exactly.
So Erik, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you another question. So if you had anything else to complement, it's the right time.
So going back to this testing thing is, if you don't test it, what happens is that the development team, and this development team can be large or can be small, but what tends to happen if you don't test is that you do produce something that works, and it may work perfectly, but it's designed for the 5, 10, to 20, whatever amount of people that designed it, because you did not expose it to other people. And you only got feedback from the development team. That's something that we should avoid in any area of development.
Even if the development team is the target audience, always go ahead and test it with other people, because their hearts are there as well as yours. So, make sure you have some outside feedback also. So again, Erik, I wanted to ask you this question, and we really enjoy this one because we get to meet as well interesting new people, or, get reminded of people we haven't had on the podcast, or, that we have actually had already as well. And it is all about knowing if there is somebody, listening to these questions, hearing the podcast, and you mentioned you've heard it a few times as well. Is there anybody that comes to your mind like, oh, I would definitely like to listen to, who's that person?
If you would have asked me this question 5 months ago, I would have said Jeff Engelstein, but I know that you already interviewed him. A great interview with him, by the way. And you mentioned something that at the beginning, or you use a word to describe how I am perhaps working. And I tend to mix. One thing I do as well is I mix listening to not only people who work in games and gamification, but I listen to, for example, people talking about chemistry or physics or whatever, and then try to use that little bit of information to see if I can adapt it to what I do. And on this topic of randomness, I would say that I would love if you could get Nassim Taleb in this show. I don't know if you have heard this name before. He wrote
I'm not sure, but it sounds familiar. What's the name of the book?
His most famous one is The Black Swan.
Oh, yes, that's why. I haven't read it, but I've heard of it many, many times.
It's super interesting.
An interesting one. Comes completely sideways because I don't think his work is related to what we do in any way, but it could come as an interesting sideways, right?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I read about 3 or 4 of his books. The last one, I think, is called Anti-Fragility. which is something that I quite use, lessons from his book I use in my work. He does not mention, to the best of my knowledge, anything about games, but I'm sure by listening to him, you are going to guess, if you manage to get him as well in the podcast, really useful stuff.
Yeah, interesting perspectives at least. Definitely, for sure. So very interesting possible guest. And continuing that streak of recommendations, what book would you recommend this audience, the engagers, to read? And why, of course?
Okay, so right now I'm actually reading a book by Jeff Engelson, and it's Game Tech. The book is amazing, and the book is actually based on a podcast, Ludology. The podcast is already on a 250th edition, but I started listening from the number 1, and I'm kind of from number 2, 12, 13, and they are super interesting. And the reason I'm moving so slowly is because every time I start listening to that, I get so into it, and then I start taking notes, and so I listen to the podcast, kind of going back, listen again, going back, listen again. And the book Game Tech is based on the little nudges of information, pretty much all of them based on science and mathematics and behavior, which Jeff specializes on, and is put in the book. Amazing. It's really, really fascinating.
Interesting. Sounds like a fantastic book. I think Jeff mentioned that he was either working on it, had just launched it. That's a recent one from him. Is that correct? Or am I completely off the books?
Game Tech is an old one. The one that he just released now is prototyping and testing your game. I think it's called like that.
Yes, you're right. Completely right. Yes, absolutely makes sense. And I thought I had heard that one, but maybe it was because he mentioned it on some other capacity. Yes. And I mean, you probably remember him from his episode Engagers. He was a fantastic guest, so knowledgeable. He's also been, as you were mentioning on that podcast, Ludology, which he was leading at some point. I mean, he's absolutely fantastic. So no questions asked on how that book is probably going to be absolutely amazing.
Exactly. And there is one book I want to buy, I haven't bought. And so if you want another recommendation for the listeners,
sure, why not?
Is a book by another super fascinating person, Daniel Kahneman, and the book is called Noise. So the previous one was like a super bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, and this one is called Noise. It's amazing. I haven't read it, but I think it's amazing.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And, he has a pretty good track record on writing books and writing interesting stuff.
Yes.
Definitely. So it sounds like a very, very sweet recommendation. So, Erik, we talked about those recommendations, but we also want to know about you, What would you say is your superpower in this world of creating games and learning games and gamification? What would you say is that sweet spot, that thing that you do at least better than most other people?
Well, something that I have for the past few years, at the beginning I was joking, but now it's kind of true, and I call it my superpower, is I have a few learning disabilities. One of them is dyslexia, and I sometimes need to read very, very slow. But because of reading slow, and it's not just me, of course, there's many people that need to read slow for whatever reason is, but reading slow brings you a different perspective on the material that you're reading. So
brings you pause as well, right?
Yeah, you see things that sometimes you do not see when you're reading fast, or when you're reading at, let's call it, the normal speeds for the average population, the average person in the population. Not necessarily rushing through, but let's say you read X amount of words per minute, and I read considerably less. So it's not fast or slow. My speed is different than yours, but because I need to kind of go back and forth sometimes. I heard this research as well that MI5 or MI6, I can't remember, in the United Kingdom, doing this program where they actually hire people specifically with learning disabilities and other forms of kind of, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it learning disabilities, for lack of a better word, because people in such circumstances are able to see the world in a way that the average usually don't.
Interesting. Sounds like very, very interesting research as well. And we get to the most difficult question of the podcast. according to many of our guests at least, and probably according to me as well. Erik, what would you say is your favorite game?
Aha. I love Azul, Summer Pavilion. That's a game that I tend to recommend to quite a lot of people. It's easy to play, it's easy to learn. That's the important, because one of the reasons a lot of people don't play board games, I'm not sure this happens as well with digital games, but one reason people don't play board games is because they're afraid of the rules. The rules can be a little bit complicated sometimes.
And that huge rule book.
Yeah, I know.
All that reading. Oh my goodness, that is terrible. Reading sounds like, a terrible thing.
Exactly. So this game is super easy to learn, and you start playing it. And a couple of times I put it in front of people who literally told me, I hate board games. And by the end of the game, those people who said I hate it wanted to play one more round, or actually came back to my house for gatherings that I organize sometimes because they wanted to play this game. So, when we say we hate something, it's because we usually don't understand it or don't want to understand it. But once we are given this opportunity, we end up kind of loving as, that thing that we were supposed to hate.
That's very, very interesting as well. And you were mentioning Azul. It's one of my favorite games, definitely. We have it, the board game here. But very recently, we were introduced to a game that has been compared a lot to Azul, which is Sagrada. It's about the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of it?
I have not, but I will look into it.
Look it up. It is, one of the things that you said you loved is the simplicity. This one is definitely not that simple, especially to explain, because it has many more considerations. But it does have the element, of the colors, of the sort of the beauty of the game is present there as well. And it has a bit more, well, it actually has dice, but in a very non-traditional way. So I think you're probably going to enjoy at least finding out about this game, even though, again, it is not as beautifully simple as Azul. So, Erik, we are running out of time. But before we go, of course, we want to let you tell us, where can we find you in the world of the internet? Somebody wants to connect with you, make you questions, find more about your work, whatever that looks like. Where can you send them to? And of course, if you have any final piece of advice, it is the right time.
Sure. Well, my website is 3 words, playlearndevelop.ie. It's an Irish domain. You can, just look that up, yourself or the listeners. But as well, by simply Googling my name, by doing a search on Erik Agudelo, you should be able to as well, find my social media channels like YouTube and LinkedIn. Yeah, I would say that those are the main ways to, get in touch with me.
Absolutely. Some of those were as well the way in which we reconnected, because as you mentioned, we've met online, we've met face-to-face, we've done all the things in that sense. So, Erik, thank you very much for, dedicating this time, investing this time in the engagers, sharing your experience, your knowledge, and all of these topics that we've been discussing. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Erik. Do you have any questions that you would like to ask any other future guests? All you have to do is go to professorgame.com/question and ask that question. And if it is selected, it will come up in a future episode and you will get your answer. And remember, before you go on to your next mission, if you haven't, go ahead and subscribe, or now they call it follow, on your favorite podcast app, whether that is iTunes, Stitcher, whatever that's going to look like. Make sure you subscribe, that you follow on that podcast app, and that you listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.